Hello, and thank you for being here with me today. Before this story begins, I want you to take a slow breath. Not a deep one that feels forced, just a natural breath. And as you breathe, I want you to notice something simple. Notice how easy it is to appear strong, and how difficult it is to admit that you are not. For a long time, I believed that strength meant never breaking. My name is Martin, and for most of my life, I misunderstood what strength truly meant. I thought strong people were the ones who always had control, the ones who never hesitated, never doubted themselves, never cried when things became overwhelming. I believed that strength was something you showed, something others could see. So I tried to become that version of strength. I tried to become someone who did not feel too much, someone who could move through life without being affected by the weight of emotions. At first, it seemed to work. I learned how to manage my emotions carefully, almost like organizing something fragile that should never be seen. When something hurt me, I stayed quiet. When I felt overwhelmed, I pushed through. When I felt exhausted, I told myself that resting was unnecessary, that stopping would somehow mean failure. Over time, this way of living became natural. It no longer felt like an effort. It felt like who I was. People often described me as reliable, calm, and strong. They trusted me. They depended on me. And I accepted those words without questioning them, because they matched the image I had been trying to create. From the outside, everything looked stable. I had a job. I had responsibilities. I had a life that appeared to move forward in the right direction. There were no dramatic failures, no visible struggles, nothing that would make someone look at me and think that something was wrong. But inside, something felt different, not broken, not in a way that could be clearly defined, but heavy. It was a quiet kind of heaviness, the kind that doesn't interrupt your life suddenly, but slowly settles into it over time, like carrying something invisible that becomes harder to ignore the longer you hold it. At first, I didn't question it. I thought it was normal. I told myself that everyone feels this way sometimes, that this was simply part of being an adult, part of handling responsibility. My struggles did not begin with a single event. They began quietly, almost unnoticed. At work, the pressure slowly increased. Deadlines became tighter, expectations grew higher, and the feeling that I was always slightly behind began to follow me everywhere. Even when I completed tasks, there was always something else waiting, something unfinished, something that demanded more from me. At first, I told myself this was normal. Everyone feels pressure. Everyone gets tired. Everyone struggles sometimes. So I continued. I worked longer hours. I stayed later than necessary. I told myself that if I just tried harder, everything would return to a sense of balance. But it didn't. The more I pushed, the more something inside me resisted. It was not loud, not something I could easily explain, but it was there, a quiet resistance, a feeling that something was not right, even if I could not yet understand what it was. At the same time, my relationships began to shift. Not dramatically, not in ways that others would notice immediately, but in small, subtle ways. Conversations felt shorter. I listened, but I wasn't fully present. I responded, but something inside me remained distant. It was as if a part of me had stepped back, watching instead of participating. I didn't know how to explain it then, but I felt like I was slowly disconnecting from my own life, as if I was there physically, but not emotionally. My body moved through routines, completed tasks, followed schedules, but my mind felt somewhere else, slightly removed from everything that was happening. And then there was my health. Nothing serious at first, just small signs that were easy to ignore. Trouble sleeping, constant fatigue, a feeling of tension that never fully disappeared, even in moments that were supposed to be restful. My body was trying to tell me something, but I wasn't listening, because ignoring it felt easier than understanding it. Whenever someone asked me how I was doing, I gave the same answer. I'm fine. It became automatic, a response I no longer thought about, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. How do you describe a storm that has no clear shape? How do you explain a weight that has no visible cause? So I didn't try. I carried everything quietly, believing that was strength, believing that being strong meant handling everything alone, without asking for help, without showing weakness. I thought that as long as I could continue functioning, continue working, continue showing up, then nothing was really wrong. But there is a difference between functioning and living, and I did not understand that yet. Days passed, weeks passed, months passed, and slowly, without realizing it, I became someone who was always slightly overwhelmed. Not enough to stop, not enough to collapse, but enough to feel it constantly. The feeling was always there, just beneath the surface, like a quiet tension that never fully disappeared. There were moments when I noticed it more clearly. Late at night, when everything became quiet, when there were no distractions, no conversations, no responsibilities demanding my attention. In those moments, I could feel the weight more strongly, but instead of staying with it, I distracted myself. I reached for my phone. I watched something. I told myself I would think about it later. Later became a familiar word, a place where everything uncomfortable was postponed. But postponed does not mean resolved. It only means delayed. And the more I delayed, the more the weight grew. Until one evening, something changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to make me stop. It had been a long day, the kind that feels endless while you are inside it. Work had been overwhelming. Conversations had felt exhausting. Everything required more energy than I seemed to have. When I finally returned home, the silence of my apartment felt heavier than usual. I didn't turn on the lights immediately. I didn't sit on the couch. Instead, I walked slowly into the middle of the room and just stood there for a few seconds. Nothing happened, and then, without warning, I felt something rise inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something deeper, something I had been holding back for a very long time. My chest tightened. My breathing became uneven, and suddenly I realized something I had never allowed myself to admit before. I was tired, not physically, but completely, deeply tired. Tired of holding everything in. Tired of pretending everything was okay. Tired of being strong in a way that required me to ignore myself. Tired of carrying a version of strength that left no room for honesty. The realization was quiet, but undeniable. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I did something I had never done before. I stopped trying to be strong. I slowly sat down on the floor. There was no plan, no intention, just a feeling that I could not continue the way I had been. The silence around me no longer felt empty. It felt honest, and as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I whispered something I had never said out loud before. I can't do this anymore. The words were soft, almost fragile, but they carried a truth I could no longer ignore. And as they settled into the silence, something inside me began to shift. That moment did not fix everything, but it changed something because, for the first time, I was not pretending. For the first time, I was not hiding. For the first time, I allowed myself to be human, not perfect, not strong in the way I had always believed, but real. And that honesty, as small and fragile as it felt in that moment, became the beginning of something I had been missing for a very long time. The beginning of understanding, the beginning of change, the beginning of finally learning what strength truly means. After that night, nothing in my life changed on the outside. The next morning still arrived as it always did. The alarm rang at the same time, sharp and familiar, pulling me out of sleep in the same mechanical way it always had. The sunlight entered the room in that same quiet, gentle way, touching the walls, the floor, the edges of my life without asking whether I was ready for a new day. The world continued moving forward, completely unaware of what had shifted inside me, and yet something had changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see. There were no visible signs, no sudden decisions, no announcements. If someone had looked at me that morning, they would have seen the same person, following the same routine, stepping into the same life, but inside there was a difference I could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, I carried a sentence with me throughout the day. I can't do this anymore. It was not a complaint. It did not come from frustration or anger. It was not a moment of weakness. It was something deeper than that. It was a truth, and truth, once recognized, does not disappear easily. It stays. It follows you. It quietly reshapes the way you see everything. At work, everything looked the same. Emails waited for responses. Meetings followed their usual schedule. Conversations continued with the same rhythm, the same familiar patterns. People spoke, deadlines approached, tasks demanded attention. But my experience of those things had changed. Before, I moved through my day automatically. I responded quickly, completed tasks efficiently, and pushed myself forward without questioning anything. There was no space between action and reaction. Everything happened quickly, almost without thought now. There was a pause, a small space between what happened and how I responded. In that space, I began to notice things I had ignored for a long time. I noticed how tired I felt during simple tasks, the kind of tiredness that did not come from physical effort but from something deeper. I noticed how quickly my mind became overwhelmed, even when the situation itself had not changed. I noticed how often I was pretending to have more energy than I actually did, pretending to be focused when my thoughts were scattered, pretending to be okay when I wasn't. These observations were uncomfortable because they revealed something I had avoided for years. I was not okay, and more importantly, I had not been okay for a long time. That realization did not arrive as a shock. It came quietly, like something I had always known but had never allowed myself to admit. It was not new information. It was simply acknowledged for the first time. For years, I had measured my well-being by my ability to function. If I could complete my work, maintain my responsibilities, and appear stable, then I assumed everything was fine. As long as nothing collapsed, as long as I kept moving forward, I believed I was doing well. But functioning is not the same as being well, and I was beginning to understand that difference in a way I never had before. One afternoon, during a meeting, I found myself sitting there, listening to others speak while a quiet thought repeated in my mind. How long can I continue like this? The question did not demand an answer, but it stayed. It followed me through the rest of the day, appearing in small moments of silence, returning when I least expected it. It was not urgent, but it was persistent. Later that evening, I returned home and sat in silence. This time, I did something different. I did not reach for my phone. I did not turn on the television. I did not try to distract myself. I stayed. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Silence has a way of bringing forward what we have been avoiding. Without distraction, there is nothing to hide behind, nothing to soften the truth. But I remained there, breathing slowly, allowing my thoughts to settle, and gradually, something became clear. I had spent years trying to be strong in a way that required me to ignore my own needs. I had built a version of strength that depended on endurance, on pushing through, on carrying more than I could hold without ever stopping. I had believed that strength meant endurance, that the more I could tolerate, the stronger I was, that stopping meant weakness, that asking for help meant failure. But what if that belief was wrong? What if strength was not about how much you could carry, but about knowing when to stop carrying things alone? The idea felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. It challenged everything I had believed about myself, everything I had built my identity around. For most of my life, I had taken pride in being independent, in not needing help, in being someone others could rely on, someone who could handle anything without hesitation. But I had never asked myself a simple question. Who was I relying on? The question settled into the silence, heavier than anything I had considered before, and the answer was difficult, because the truth was, no one. And for the first time, I began to understand that maybe the strongest thing I could do was not to keep going alone, but to finally admit that I didn't have to. That realization did not change me overnight. I did not suddenly become calm, balanced, or emotionally strong in a completely new way. In fact, the days that followed felt even more confusing than before, because once you stop ignoring yourself, you begin to hear everything you have been avoiding, and that can feel overwhelming in a way you are not prepared for. At first, I didn't know what to do with this awareness. For years, my life had been built around movement, staying busy, staying productive, focusing on responsibilities, and pushing forward no matter how I felt. Slowing down had never been something I practiced. It had always been something I avoided. But now, slowing down was no longer a choice. It was something my mind and body were quietly asking for, almost as if they had been waiting for me to finally listen. So, I began with something small. I started paying attention, not in a complicated or overwhelming way, but in simple, ordinary moments that I had previously moved through without noticing. When I woke up in the morning, I noticed how I felt before reaching for my phone. When I sat at my desk, I noticed how quickly tension began to build in my shoulders. When someone spoke to me, I paid attention to whether I was truly listening or simply waiting for my turn to respond. These observations were not always comfortable. Sometimes they revealed how distracted I had become, how often my attention was divided, how rarely I was fully present. Sometimes they showed how impatient I had grown, how quickly I reacted instead of understanding. And sometimes they reminded me of something deeper, how little attention I had been giving to my own inner world for a very long time. But I stayed with them, because something inside me understood that this was important. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, I sat quietly and asked myself a question I had never truly taken seriously before. What do I actually need right now? The question felt simple, almost too simple, but the answer did not come immediately. For so long, I had been focused on what needed to be done that I had forgotten how to ask what I needed. My mind was used to solving problems, completing tasks, meeting expectations, not listening inward. So I waited, and slowly, the answer appeared. I need rest. Not the kind of rest that comes from distraction. Not watching something, not scrolling endlessly, not filling my mind with noise just to escape discomfort. Real rest, the kind where you allow yourself to stop without guilt. That night, I did something unfamiliar. I turned everything off. No music, no screen, no background noise. I simply lay down and allowed the quiet to exist. At first, my mind resisted. Thoughts appeared quickly, one after another. Things I needed to do, things I should have done, things I might forget. But instead of following those thoughts, I let them pass, like clouds moving across the sky, and gradually something softened. My breathing slowed, my body relaxed, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a small sense of ease. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't solve everything, but it was real, and that was enough. From that moment, I began to understand something important. Taking care of yourself is not a grand decision. It is a series of small choices, repeated quietly over time. Choosing to pause instead of pushing. Choosing to listen instead of ignoring. Choosing to respond gently instead of reacting automatically. These choices seem small, but over time, they change everything. I also began to notice how often I had been reacting to situations without thinking. When something went wrong, I immediately blamed myself. When someone seemed distant, I assumed I had done something wrong. When I felt overwhelmed, I told myself I should be able to handle it. These reactions had become automatic, almost invisible, but now I started to pause, just for a few seconds, long enough to ask a different question. Is this actually true? And sometimes the answer was no. Sometimes the situation was not as serious as I had imagined. Sometimes I was being harder on myself than necessary, and sometimes I simply needed to be kinder. That pause became powerful because it gave me something I'd not had before. Choice for the first time. I could choose how to respond instead of reacting immediately. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to notice the difference. And that difference, even when small, began to change the way I experienced my life. There were still difficult moments. Moments when stress returned, when I felt overwhelmed again, when old habits tried to take over. But even in those moments, something had shifted. I was no longer completely lost inside them. I could see them. I could recognize them. And seeing them made all the difference. Because awareness does not remove difficulty, but it changes your relationship with it. And that, slowly and quietly, was the beginning of something new. As time passed, the changes in my life did not appear all at once. They did not arrive as a sudden transformation or a clear moment where everything finally made sense. Instead, they unfolded quietly, almost unnoticed at first, through small decisions, through gentle awareness, and through a different way of responding to the same situations I had faced for years. From the outside, my life still looked familiar. I continued going to work, continued meeting people, continued handling responsibilities. Nothing dramatic had changed, nothing that others could easily point to and say, "This is different." But the way I experienced my life had completely shifted. I was no longer trying to prove that I was strong. For so long, strength had been something I performed, something I showed through control, through endurance, through silence. I believed that as long as I could keep everything together on the outside, I was doing well. But now, strength felt different. It felt quieter, more honest, more human. It no longer required me to hide parts of myself. It allowed me to exist as I was, without constant pressure to appear composed. I began to notice that I no longer reacted as quickly as before. When something stressful happened, I didn't immediately push myself harder or try to fix everything at once. I paused, even if just for a few seconds, and in that pause, I asked myself something simple: what do I need right now? Sometimes the answer was to continue, to move forward and finish what I had started. Sometimes the answer was to rest, to step back for a moment. And sometimes the answer was simply to breathe. That question became a kind of anchor, something steady I could return to when everything around me felt overwhelming. I also noticed changes in my conversations. Before, I often listened while thinking about what I would say next, preparing my response instead of truly hearing the other person. Now, I listened more fully, not perfectly, but more intentionally, and something interesting began to happen. When I slowed down, other people slowed down too. Conversations became less rushed, more real, more connected. There was less pressure to perform, less need to prove anything. I no longer felt the same need to control how I was perceived. I didn't need to appear strong all the time, and because of that, I felt lighter. Not because life had suddenly become easier, but because I was no longer carrying unnecessary pressure that I had placed on myself for years. There was a moment, one evening, that stayed with me. I had just finished a long day. Nothing special had happened. No major success, no major failure, just an ordinary day. I was walking home slowly, the sky beginning to darken, the air quiet and still. For no particular reason, I stopped for a moment and looked around. People were passing by, some talking, some silent, some lost in their own thoughts. And suddenly, I realized something simple. I was okay, not perfectly happy, not completely free from stress, but okay, present here. And that feeling, as small as it was, felt meaningful in a way I could not fully explain. Because for so long, I had been waiting for a moment where everything would feel completely right, where all the pressure would disappear, where I would finally feel in control. That moment never came. Instead, what arrived was something quieter: acceptance. Acceptance that life will always include uncertainty. Acceptance that not every feeling needs to be fixed. Acceptance that being human means experiencing both strength and vulnerability at the same time. I no longer saw my struggles as something that needed to be removed. I began to see them as something that could be understood, something that had shaped me, something that had taught me the exhaustion I once felt had shown me the limits of pushing too hard. The stress had shown me the importance of slowing down. The discomfort had shown me the need to listen more carefully to myself. None of these experiences were easy, but they were meaningful. And as this understanding grew, so did my definition of strength. Strength is not about never feeling overwhelmed. It is not about controlling everything or always knowing what to do. Strength is about staying present when things feel uncertain, staying kind to yourself when things feel difficult, staying open even when it would be easier to close yourself off. Even learning English became part of this realization. I no longer saw it as something I needed to master perfectly. Instead, it became something I practiced gently. When I spoke in English, I still paused, still searched for words, still made mistakes, but I stayed. I didn't rush. I didn't judge myself, and over time, I realized something important. Fluency is not just about language, it is about comfort, comfort with uncertainty, comfort with imperfection, comfort with continuing even when things are not perfect, and that comfort extended beyond language. It became part of how I lived. I no longer waited to feel completely ready before taking action. I no longer believed I needed to be perfect to move forward. I allowed myself to try, to learn, to adjust, to continue. Life did not become perfect, but it became more real, more grounded, more connected. I still have difficult days. Days when I feel tired, when I feel uncertain, when old habits try to return. But now, I recognize those moments. I don't fight them, and I don't ignore them. I sit with them, I listen, and I respond with care. And that is the difference. Because if you are listening to this story, and something here feels familiar, I want to say this gently. You do not need to prove your strength. You do not need to carry everything alone. You do not need to have all the answers right now. You only need to begin with something small, a pause, a breath, a moment of honesty with yourself, because strength is not something you build by pushing harder. It is something you discover when you stop running away, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stay. Stay with yourself, stay with your experience, stay with your life exactly as it is. Because within that staying, something begins to change, quietly, slowly, but truly. And that change is more powerful than anything you could force. Before we end this story, I want you to take a quiet moment and notice something. How often do you try to be strong without ever asking yourself what you truly need? Maybe you keep going even when you feel exhausted. Maybe you stay silent even when something inside you wants to speak. Maybe you carry everything alone because that's what you've always believed strength looks like. But what if strength is something different? What if strength is not about pushing harder, but about knowing when to pause? What if it's not about hiding your struggles, but about allowing yourself to feel them without running away? Tonight, you don't need to fix everything. You don't need to have all the answers. Maybe you can begin with something smaller. A breath, a pause, a simple moment of honesty with yourself. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to keep going. It is to stay. Stay with yourself. Stay with what you feel. Stay long enough to truly listen. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. And if you'd like to continue learning English through calm and meaningful stories like this one, you can stay here. There is another story waiting for you.